Okay, today I want to do two things. I want to talk about the centralization of the French state and the question why Paris, and that's kind of fun to talk about, and the role of Paris in centralization and the particular role of Paris in French economic, political, social, and cultural life. And then in the last 20 minutes, I'll talk about why this sort of strange man, the former miracle baby, as he was called after his birth, the Comte de Chambord, did not become King of France, Henry V, and why France ended up a republic and how. And that has something to do with the centralization of the French state. Now, anyone who has ever spent any time in France at all, who has ever waited in line in a prefecture, in a Privas or Agen or Paris, God forbid, remain for hours, will realize that the role of Paris and the role of the centralization of the French state is unique at least in Western European history. And over the long run, and it still is, despite all of the Mitterrand's plans for decentralization and the creation of regional councils. Basically, France remains the most centralized state in Western Europe, and the role of Paris in French life does not have an equivalent in other European countries. Now let me think about that. Let's think out loud about that other statement. Think of other countries. In Spain, obviously, Madrid is the capital, but Barcelona is terribly, terribly important and was always a much more economically important city than the kind of command economy that was Madrid. Or if you think of Berlin, you think of Germany, a unified Germany, or in the Federal Republic before German unification, Berlin was terribly important. It is now again the capital, but Berlin is balanced off by Munich and by Frankfurt in some important ways. Or if you take a little country like Scotland, Edinburgh and Glasgow are two major cities. Or if you take England, for example, people came to care in very major ways what people in Manchester thought. Because Manchester becomes the capital essentially of the north and the economic center of production. Or if you take Russia, Moscow was always the religious core. Nicholas II just hated Moscow. It represented all those values that he thought were Russian. But St. Petersburg, Leningrad became Petrograd. Leningrad became a major city, and because of the residence of the Tsar, that's where it was. Or if you take almost anywhere else, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, before it broke up, Vienna was now this oversized capital that in a very, very small country, but it was balanced off by Budapest. In Italy, obviously, Milan and Turin were terribly important cities, and Rome was just a sort of a sleepy ecclesiastical capital full of tourists and clergy. But France is unique. Paris, the role of Paris in French life is unique, and that has been accentuated over the centuries, particularly the last century and a half, by some of the things that I want to talk about. In 1947, there was a book published called Paris in the French Desert that looked at this sort of unusual thing. That where else but in France would then 97% of the population be considered provincials in a very derogatory, a very pejorative sense, and Paris would be the place that all of the Rastignacs of France would try to go because of the economic, political, social, and cultural domination of the capital. Rastignac who's before this course, but was the central figure, or one of them, in Balzac's novel Old Goriot, Père Goriot, and he's a sort of a somewhat poor noble from the Charente in the west of France, who's going to hit the big time and wants to sleep with all the right ladies and become wealthy without doing any work. And he became sort of a symbol for this aggressive provincial, in this case, sort of poor noble who has to get to Paris to make the big time, because the big time could only be there. Now, I mean, in almost any domain you can think of, I mean, one exception, this is not the time for me to talk about it, though I would love to do that, is gastronomy. Because although Lyon is considered, Lyon is not the capital of any region, it was the second most important city in France and still is, even though it's slightly smaller now than Marseille. If you just count the city, Lyon became the capital of French gastronomy and not Paris. But that's almost the exception. And one of the reasons why the role of the dominance of Paris is so great is precisely because of the centralization of the French state. You know, in my memory, as a young guy, hanging out and drinking a cheap wine in Paris, when I was doing my thesis, you could only hear on the news people with Parisian accents giving the news, only. And then before the news, they had this little thing they called actualité régionale, where if you lived in Auvergne, there would be, you would have a 15-minute program talking about local events, and you might have somebody who had an Auvergnat accent. Or if you lived in Marseille or in Nice, you might have somebody with a southern accent giving, the news about local schools and having pictures of, young women presenting flowers to some, corrupt politician, and it would be like that. But basically, the news was always given by people with a northern accent, either a Loire Valley accent, and they're very proud. They think they speak the best French, but a Parisian accent. But that's all changed. But the reality of the situation that Paris is overly dominant has not changed at all. And Balzac, to go back to Balzac, he put it the way Parisians view the provinces, and this is still the case. He described provincials as being dominated by routine and monotony in their small towns, that they're all the same, he wrote, which is obviously not the case. He says, provincials are like moles burrowing in their little plots, or frogs at the bottom of their puddles, engaged in sordid, trivial rivalries, moved by petty jealousies, avarice, and material interests. Since they do not think about the things that are serious, they get excited by tiny things. Now, you used to have, there was a very famous cover of the New Yorker in which you had a map of the United States seen from New York, and where you had New York, and then you had this sort of large, ditch that are finally, and then Los Angeles was a half a football throw away, and everything in the middle was this sort of desert, basically. And certainly the way that provincial people, including myself, and we're legally residents in France, and we live in Ardèche, and I'm proud of it, view Parisians is often with that same kind of contempt that the Parisians look at us. And then, for example, in France, and if this ever disappears, I'm going to be one unhappy guy. The license plates, the last numbers of the license plate tells you where people are from. So if you have a 61, you're from the Aisne. If you have a 62, you're from the Pas-de-Calais. Or if you have a 63, you're from the Puy-de-Dôme. And you can amuse yourself as you're driving along, saying, "Well, that guy from Châteauroux is off to visit his cousin in Besançon." That's the way I get by driving long rides. But during the vacation seasons in July and August, when all of us down here are inundated with tourists, when people see those 75s, which is the license plate for Paris, or this is not on the test, or if they see 77, 78s, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, they know it's Paris and it's Paris region, and they know that there'll be certain expectations, often condescending expectations, that will be in the way that Parisians and people from the La Région Parisienne present themselves vis-a-vis, we poor struggling frogs in our little ponds. Now that has changed for sure. But the centralization of the French government and the domination of Paris over the life of the nation is very difficult to change over a long period of time. Now, I guess one of the key kind of indicators of what's going on, in terms of economics, the dominance of the Paris region in terms of the economy, is that Lyon, which was always France's second city, first in gastronomy, as I said earlier, the Bank of Lyon, the Crédit Lyonnais, that is the Lyon Bank, in the 1860s moves its headquarters to Paris, not in Lyon, as if it's sort of given up. And people, for example, who follow the Lyon opera always say, well, our opera is fine, but it's nothing, of course, like Paris, where all the resources are poured into Paris. How did it get this way? I mean, just thinking over the long run, well, how did France end up so centralized? I mean, all states, centralized, became larger and centralized their ability to extract resources from their population. If you take Europe in 1500, the year 1500, there were about 1,500 territorial states. And they ranged from big consolidated monarchies like Spain and England and France to bishoprics such as Trier in Germany that were hardly bigger than the gardens of the archbishops who ran them. But over a long period of time, state-making is one of the essential processes in European history. The creation of more powerful monarchical states and eventually of national states with a variety of political outcomes, the unification of Italy to the extent Italy has ever been unified, the unification of Germany, in 1871 and Italy in the 1850s and 60s. But in the case of France, if you go to the 16th century, if you go to these chateaux around the Loire, and you see all of this beautiful furniture that's been made by skilled artisans. One you always see is you see this big case with handles on it, and they were, that's where the king's documents and the minister of the garde des sceaux, the chief financial officer and justice officer, where all their papers were, because the monarchy really didn't have a capital. The monarchy was wherever the king was. And it's in the 16th century that Paris becomes the capital. Paris is not in the middle of France, as you can clearly see, but you're not going to have a capital in Montluçon or something like that. And so you have the kings there, and the whole process of absolutism, which you don't have to know about, but it's in the 17th century that European rulers expand their power vis-a-vis their enemies, land grabbing. That's how France ends up with Alsace, and as I said before, increasing their ability to extract resources. That is to take money from very ordinary people. And so Louis XIV, who liked to call himself the sun god, a modest megalomaniac, he sends out officials into the provinces to enforce his will. And these dudes are called intendants. But that doesn't matter. I mean, you don't have to remember that. But they are out there, and they go through a process of negotiation with local elites, with nobles, and with the law courts. But in the end, the only thing that matters is that this increases the power of the state, that is during the period of absolute monarchy that armies become enormous. And if you travel around France, you'll see all the fortifications of Vauban, who is a military genius, Vauban, and fortresses, Perpignan and along the Pyrenees there, and up in Lille, and up along here, you'll see these fabulous fortresses, and the fortresses had to be maintained by people who are going to test the guns, the cannons, to make sure they work, and to be there all the time, and thus you have this enormous increase in standing armies. Now, and then here comes the French Revolution. And what does the French Revolution want to do? Well, it wants to rationalize the administration of France. It wants to do other things too, but that's not this course. And so instead of having, where before you had something like 100 tolls you had to pay on the Loire River if you're transporting some goods, they eliminate all those tolls. They try to create uniform weights and measures, and that'll take 100 years before that really works. But what they do is they increase the power of the center, of the government. And in order, because their arch enemies are the nobles, who are hightailing it toward Germany and toward England and everywhere else and trying to launch wars against the revolution, what they say is, well, we will undercut the authority of the church and the nobles in the provinces by creating what they call departments, départements. And so they create the departments that become part of this administrative system, so that every department, and this sounds boring, but it's actually interesting, every département in France, most of them are named after rivers, and some after mountains or proximity to the sea, will have the same officials, and that these strings that reach out into now 95 departments in France, including Corsica, all lead to Paris. And that where someone once said that Gaul was divided into 3 parts, now what happens is people living in any region in France, the 3 parts that they see are the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of War, and the Ministry of the Interior. So you have these départements, and these are created in 1790, and they still exist. The only big change came in 1860 when they consolidated the ones around Paris. But because of the growth of the Paris region, as you can see there. So if you take number 1, we don't have to go through them all, and I'm sure we won't. If you take number 1, the Ain, A-I-N, it's named after a river. Or if you take number 2, the N, A-I-S-N-E, it's named after a river. And how many hundreds of thousands of people died along there in World War I. Or you take number 3, the same thing, Allier. They're named after rivers, and they're not all the same size. The biggest physically is Dordogne, which is probably grown because there's so many British live there. Something like 8,000 full-time residents. I'm pointing toward the Charente. That doesn't do any good, but anyway, because when I get close, sometimes I can't see. And then the smallest is the Pyrenees-Orientales, which is Roussillon, which is French Catalonia. That doesn't matter. But the point is that the revolution, in order to defeat its enemies, further centralizes the state. And then along comes the little corporal, the little general, the little megalomaniac, Napoleon, N1. And he, of course, pushes centralization even further, where he liked to brag. It's one of these famous lines you find in textbooks, but that he could look at his watch and see what all the kids in the lycée that he created, the high schools, were studying at any one time. And he makes state centralization even more important. And then in the Second Empire, 1852, 1870, his nephew, who some wag once called the hat without the head, Napoleon III, what he does is he uses centralization as a tool of the state to consolidate his own power and that of the empire, and that is to undercut the residual influence of the nobility. If you wanted something, and this is still true in France today, it doesn't do any good to go to the local notable, like you did in the 18th century, say, hey, it would be, Monsieur, the little god, it would be great if we had a school. Doesn't do any good at all. And he realizes that. And so the patronage of the empire is that he can provide railroads, he can provide money for things, and that further centralizes the state. And so you've got these processes in the 19th century, economic processes that you find all over Europe that consolidate the power of the French state centralized in Paris. Railroads is a good example. And sometimes I throw out examples. You're not responsible for them. It's just kind of hopefully interesting for you to think about. If you think of 2 towns down here, Brive, B-R-I-V-E, famous for its rugby, and Tulle, T-U-L-L-E, which is a capital. I mentioned the first day because that's where lots of people were hung. They were the same size in the 1850s, but Brive gets the railroad and not Tulle, the railroad from Paris. And so that centralization is, also there are mountains there. It's easier to build in Brive. But the state can make or break regions with their economic patronage. And one of the reasons why France ends up with a republic and not a monarchy is because these prefects who represent the republic can go into conservative regions and say, hey, we didn't really like the way the elections came out last time. Your municipal council, a lot of monarchists there. You would like a bridge across your river, wouldn't you? And that was the case in our village because there wasn't a bridge across the river, and there's a little boat would take people across this often swirling, dangerous river. And you want your bridge? Well, let's see how the elections go next time. The state can provide these services. And the evolution of banking in the 19th century further consolidates power. There's sort of an economic takeoff in the 1850s and 60s in Paris because the state banks are in Paris, the state financial institutions are in Paris, and they can make or break investment in all of these places. Now the railroad, even in our day, maybe not your day, but still in your day. I was on the TGV the 3rd day it opened, it opened on September 28th, 1981, and I was there on September 30th taking the trip to Lyon, though it only went fast when it got to It really got to a certain point here. Now, but the railroads, if you look at the map of the railroads in France, at any time you want, including now, all tracks lead to Paris. So, for example, now, if you want to go from, say you're in Lyon, and you want to go to Bordeaux, you're going to be broke. The reason, unless you can take about 8 hours to do it, because the way you're going to do it is that you're going to take a train that goes 1 hour and 58 minutes to Paris, and then you're going to take another train that zips down here in about 4 hours to Bordeaux, but you're paying by kilometer, so it's going to be terribly expensive. When I was commuting between Limoges and Paris, that was still a long trip then. There was no TGV. It was about 4 hours, and when I once took the train over to Poitiers, it took 3 hours. Because if you go across the lines, it's not good. Now, how do trains, obvious reason how trains reinforce the predominance of Paris. Take my business, the teaching profession, is that the domination of Paris is such that you have this phenomenon in France, which they still call it that. They call it turbo-prof. And a turbo train was a fast train before the TGV. The first ones went to Normandy to carry the wealthy Parisians to Deauville. And a turbo-prof is somebody who lives in Paris and whose dream is to teach at Paris, particularly at Paris 1. French universities are named very poetically, Paris 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way through 14, which is a real hole, or 13 is probably the worst. But the turbo-prof will be somebody who is assigned to Reims, and who takes the train there every day, or to Tours. But to Lyon also, since this is only 2 hours, this is 440 kilometers. 2 hours, you can be on the damn train to New York City, and you'll be lucky if you get 80 miles in 2 hours, or an hour and 50 minutes. So you've got people who live in Lyon who teach in Paris, or friends of mine that teach in Lille and live in Paris, or I teach in Rouen frequently, who live in Paris and teach in Rouen. Now, this is bad because what it does is it sort of sucks local university life out, and it means that this phenomenon of the turbo-prof has been accentuated by the fast train. The fast train, by the way, I keep referring to it, is called the TGV, the train de grande vitesse, because ça roule, it goes fast. So, the 19th century accentuates all of this, and the result is that still by 1947, when Gravier wrote this book called Paris in the French Desert, if you look at an encyclopedia, the definition of provincial, somebody who's provincial, was still provincial, someone who is gauche, and that's not politics, who's kind of a bumpkin, kind of a plouc, kind of a day late and a dollar short, who lacks distinction. I'm reading this right out of the Larousse dictionary. For example, to give the impression of being provincial was, like you've just arrived at the train from Brittany and Gare Montparnasse, and you're just so totally out of it, you can hardly find a place to buy crêpes, and that's all you want to do, and you're sort of clueless. And so the departments, along with the railroads, and along with better roads also, and the banking network, increases the centralization of the French state. And I can remember, this is about 20 years ago, but there was big demonstrations from people in Brittany because there's always these boats crashing ashore and oil slicks all over the Breton coast, or people that produce artichokes, the price of artichokes, because of the mevente. The prices are so low there that they're always rushing down to the prefecture and dumping artichokes in the prefecture and protesting. And I remember there's one amazing a photo from the Place de la Concorde, which is a big place in Paris, a big square, where you've got these Breton mayors who are wearing their sashes, their tricolor sashes, red, white, and blue. And the police are using the CRS, which are the military police. They're a little less vicious than they used to be, but I was in a demonstration against Sarkozy in mid-May, and the police were, the CRS with their sort of carte blanche now, were fairly aggressive. But anyway, these police were wrestling to the ground these mayors who were protesting, using their tricolor sashes to, threatening to strangle them with their own sashes of their authority. Only in France would this be possible. And so every government that comes to power, they say, well, we're going to do something about this. De Gaulle said, he didn't really say that, it was Mao, but let the hundreds of thousands of flowers bloom. But de Gaulle, who we'll talk about later, de Gaulle said, how in the hell can you run a state in which there are 440 different kinds of cheese? There are a lot more than that. And he believed that it was insidious in order to have these sort of regional cultures. I'll give you an example. It was illegal. It is still illegal in France to name a baby a name that is not officially approved. Absolutely. There was or even to adopt one. There was a famous case in the 1970s or 80s. There was a family called Trognon, and a Trognon is a cigarette butt. And when they tried to adopt a baby that would be called, let's say, Jean-Philippe Trognon, they said, oh no, that baby would be damaged by having such a last name. You don't have the right to adopt this baby. And there were cases where Bretons tried to name their children Breton names, and the French state said, pas possible, because it wasn't officially French. Well, de Gaulle has been dead for a very long time, and there has been progress. But what has not changed is still the power in Paris, in these ministries, to dictate the life of schools, of almost everything else. And a lot of the strikes that you see in high schools and I better get to my lecture, but you see in high schools and even in middle schools have to do with the state suddenly saying, well, we're going to take away 200 teachers in your department. Or we're gonna maintain a curriculum that doesn't seem to make any sense. My son, when he was in Seconde, which is first year of French high school, they were out blocking traffic until some angry driver rolled over the foot of a protester, and then everybody kind of went off and ate pizza. But these were reactions against what the state was trying to do. Or in the 1980s, when there were huge demonstrations by people favoring the Catholic Church as an institution vis-a-vis education. It was the same thing with they're reacting against the kind of dictates or diktat coming down from Paris. And when Gambetta, whom you can read about, whom I mentioned the other day, when he said clericalism, there's the enemy. And then you had this sort of campaign against the church, particularly the teaching aspect of the church that's fascinating, which I'll talk about later. So France ends up like that. Many people saw themselves as administrés, that is, people who are administered, who are governed, but in the sense of having people passing papers back and forth and having to sign every damn thing you could ever imagine. It's just unbelievable, before they ever thought of themselves as being citizens. And certainly there is no other country in the post-communist world in which so many people worked for the state. Now, having said that, let me just say as an addendum, and this is my opinion, you could ignore it, that things work in France. And it used to be that 20 or 30 years ago, you thought nothing in France works and everything works in the US, and now it's just the opposite. Totally the opposite. And if you're going to be sick, and unless you're wealthy, you're better off being sick in France than you are here, because the system really works, and there are abuses. But the Social Security system, which encompasses more than just what we mean by Social Security, the Sécu, which it involves health care, is one of those things that really works, as annoying as the whole structure and the taxes and all of that. And of course the challenge, so this is the latter part of the course, is what do you do with this and Europe? Europe, as, which is going to erase these license plates and are going to take away part of what it means to live in France. And that's why I would have voted against the Constitution. I encourage people to vote against the Constitution, and I know almost nobody except professors in Paris and Lyon who were for that Constitution that was defeated a year ago, May 29th. So there. Anyway, now, how did this all happen that, given the fact in February of 1870, you had a monarchist-dominated assembly elected, in which rural regions, particularly, but not necessarily just Brittany and Normandy and Auvergne, these are big, still Catholic regions, as we'll see later, that they wanted the restoration of a monarchy. Why does that not happen? How does this country end up being a republic? The Third Republic, which has been castigated or been denounced because it seemed to fumble along, but it was the longest republic, and it lasts from, depending on when you start it, you can read about that, whether you start it in 1875 or 1877, or when there really was a republic, the early 80s, it lasts until June 1940. So how did all that happen? Now, here we move into a history that is the kind of old-style history. It's the story of decisions taken by individual people. There was a pretender to the throne, and this man was his life got off to an interesting start. He was dubbed the miracle baby for reasons that I will explain. The Comte de Chambord was a Bourbon. He was part of the royal family of Louis XIV and Louis XVI, and in 1820, his father was assassinated by a liberal, a man called Louvel. And he's at the opera, he gets kind of bored, and he walks out, they leave the opera, and this guy, Louvel, comes up and he puts a knife right through him. And it was not just a random act. He wanted to extinguish this royal line. And the Bourbons had been restored in 1815, 1830. Again, this is sort of old-style history. So France goes into great mourning. The church bells ring very, very slowly all over the place because there is the heir to the French throne is dead. And there's a huge campaign against the liberals because of that. And then lo and behold, it turns out that his widow, to whom he confessed various infidelities before expiring, was pregnant. Indeed, he was the father. They didn't run DNA tests or anything, but he was the father. And as France held its breath, because they wanted a boy, this miracle baby was born, l'enfant du miracle. And the unfortunate thing is that he was sort of a sad sack, un pauvre type. It's tough being the pretender to the throne, the would-be Henry V, and your name recognition is such that in royalist towns in the west of France, like Nantes, that somebody in the middle of the night would scribble graffiti, "Long live Henry V," and that people would get together in church on January 21st, the date that Louis XVI was executed, and they would pray for the restoration of the Bourbon throne. But there's also another family of pretenders, and that is the Orleanists. The Orleanists, but Orleanists. I just wrote it there in English. And these people, this is kind of boring, but these people were in government between 1830 and 1848. And King Louis Philippe, who was chased from the throne in February of 1848, was seen as progressive. He was seen as the bourgeois monarch, but he was perfectly noble. He'd gone to Kentucky and drunk lots of bourbon once. He carried an umbrella, that sort of middle-class symbol of protection, and he is chased from the throne in 1848. But he'd helped modernize the economy. And he did not restore the church to its old power. And the Orleanists were extremely clever, where Chambord was thick as a brick, and spent most of his time telling anti-Semitic jokes and playing cards with his cronies in an Austrian capital, in the Austrian capital or mountains near Vienna, or maybe it was near Salzburg. I guess it was near Salzburg. The Orleanists had a bunch of sons of Louis Philippe who were pretty clever. One of them, by the way, just about 10 years ago, the Orleanist family suffered a kind of an embarrassing reversal when one of the Orleanists, sort of the third in line, if there was ever an Orleanist restoration of the throne, was arrested for burglary, as being an accessory for burglary in the Pyrenees-Orientales. But anyway, so when France collapsed after the war, and when the Commune comes along, it seems to royalists, that is the people who wanted restoration of the monarchy, that their ship had come in. So what's going to happen? Now, it's easy to make fun of Chambord, who was a pauvre type, a sad sack in many ways. But the history of royalism is not, it goes beyond that. And there was a strong royalist movement, as I've already suggested, and it wasn't just people looking backwards. Indeed, he said in his various pronouncements written for him by someone else that he didn't want to be a king of the old regime. He did not want to turn the clock back to 1788, and that you could combine a modernity with monarchy. But there was never any doubt that if he was restored to the throne, that he would rule. And you have to imagine him after the Commune after the slaughter and the buildings are still burning, or at least smoldering, that he comes to Paris. And he'd never, rather like Louis Napoleon, had hardly ever been in Paris before. I mean, he really hadn't, I don't think, ever. So he gets a carriage, he rents a carriage, and he goes around as a tourist. And he goes to Notre Dame, and he goes to Saint-Chapelle, and he goes to pay homage at what they thought were the remains of his departed ancestors. And he had bone fragments of what they thought, or at least ashes of Marie Antoinette that he had with him in his room all the time. And so, but it's not, he has his entourage, he has his posse, he has his entourage. But there also are these strong traditions of popular royalism, of ordinary people and peasants who believed fervently in the monarchy. You found them in very odd places. There's a strong tradition in Nîmes, one of my favorite places, of popular royalism. And also, of course, in Brittany. I keep giving Breton examples. I'll pick other ones. And also because of the close association of the monarchy, and particularly the Legitimists, they're called Legitimists, the Bourbons, with the church, you've got fertile ground in areas that were still practicing religion. And we'll talk more about that another time. He makes clear that he is going to restore the church to its what he considered rightful place of privilege in France. And possibly, I mean, he could benefit from the wave of religious revival that occurs in France in the 1870s. Now, every time there's a big-time political disaster from the point of view of the Catholic Church in France, it's followed by a period of religious revival. After the French Revolution and Napoleon makes peace with the church, there is all of a sudden a revival of people forming religious confraternities, of people paying to rebuild churches that had been vandalized during the Revolution, where they're melting down church bells to use as cannon and things like that. The famous, beautiful, fabulous monastery church of Cluny, is up near Mac-Mahon, right here, had been destroyed, and they restored a couple of the remaining towers. And as Chateaubriand said, the writer, I don't know what we must believe, but we must believe in something, and he gets on his knees and prays. The same thing happens in the 1870s. There's a revival of that old-time religion. And it's helped by, various miracles and that kind of thing, but which I'll talk about in the lecture on religion, which is kind of fun, fun to do. For example, when you go to any town or any village in France, you will see what they call mission crosses. You'll see these crosses that are stone crosses. The first ones were put up during the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation in the 17th century to try to win back areas that had become Protestant, that is around Lyon. You find some that are put up, not surprisingly, after 1815, and the others are in the 1860s or the 1870s, and then never again. And these are big crosses that are put out, usually outside of villages. And sometimes the crosses were destroyed during the revolutions. There was a huge Orleanists destroyed the Revolution of 1830. But most of these crosses, you can read them. This is an iconography of belief. And you can see the dates, because they'll put the date, like 1868. There's about 10 of them in our village. Some of them, there's just little stumps left, but it's kind of fun to walk around and look at them. But here these proliferate wildly, and so there'll be missions. I remember when I went to Jesuit high school in Portland, Oregon, we had to have these retreats or revivals, and the priests these missionaries would come in and for 3 days thunder at you, and then people would go off and go to confession, and I didn't have much to confess. I often wish I'd had, but in those days in high school. But anyway, there we go. You'd go and do these things, and it would be a big sort of public spectacle, a spectacle. And so Henry V could capitalize on that, because there were lots of people that would be very happy to see him come back because of their belief. But it's hard if you're 47 years. Your job is a pretender to the throne. It's difficult. He had a hard time getting around. He'd had a very royal accident. He'd broken his leg falling off a horse, and he had a terrible limp, and also because he just sat around and played cards all the time and ate and drank, he became a quite large man, and occasionally he would get up and go and look at the relics of Marie Antoinette, and then he'd go back and play cards for big stakes. He was a big-time gambler, and because he wasn't a very good card player, his posse took him for fairly sizable amounts of money. But he viewed hereditary monarchy, quote, as the unique port of salvation. That's a very religious image that could save France. And he talked about strong authority underplaying judicious liberty, for example. And the key to his strength, besides the church, is the nobles. Now, having a noble title didn't do a hell of a lot of good after the French Revolution, and it's easy to give this sort of stereotype of nobles as being just letting their nails grow very long and drinking nice wines and chasing each other's mistresses and wives around the gardens in Versailles or anywhere else. In fact, many nobles became chairmen of the boards of various companies, and there still had these atavisms, these throwbacks to the old regime where, it was said near Toulouse that if the noble announced after Mass that it would be good to have a little firewood, that he could look out from the Ponderosa and see peasants, obedient peasants carrying large stacks of wood up to the big house. And maybe they get a little something on Easter from the big guy. But basically, the state was winning the battle against the nobles. And you could still be the count of anywhere or the duke of anywhere. And you can't mobilize goodies to give to local people except on a very local scale. And the state is winning out. Now, Gambetta, who was a smart guy who dies very young, he said that France became a republic because most of the people wanted a republic and they didn't want a monarchy, and that's all there was to it. And the elections in the early 1880s would certainly make this clear. Now, there was even a group of nobles who believed that they could be elected, that if you had an election, that people would actually vote to restore the monarchy. These were kind of the popular royalists of places like Nîmes. By the way, I should write these things down. Nîmes. See, in the old regime, there would have been an S there, and that's why you got this little chapeau up there. Anyway, but that wasn't going to happen because most people in France ultimately did not want a monarchy. But what about old Chambord? When he was, when disaster came, he was not ready. He issued poorly constructed manifestos in order to espouse, quote, the freedom of the church as the prime condition of the peace of spirit and order in the world, and that to protect the Pope was the honor of our country and the most incontestable cause of its glory among nations, etc., etc. But there was a big problem, that for all of his failings, human failings, and there were indeed many, and his intellectual limitations, which were daunting, he was a man of faith and loyalty to his principles, for better or for worse in this context. And in 1789, when the Bourbons were, when the revolution came and then executed old Louis XVI, the white flag of the Bourbons, plain white flag of the Bourbons, sometimes with a fleur-de-lis on it and all that, was replaced by the red, white, and blue flag, the three-colored flag, the tricolore, which was a combination of adding the color white for the Bourbons in 1789 to the red and blue that were the colors of Paris, of the city of Paris. And in the end, he refused to compromise when his advisors say, look, we can pull this off if you agree to accept the three-colored flag of revolution, of the French Revolution, which had killed his family members. And he refused to do that. And they tried to make a deal with the Orleanists, and the Orleanists produced children, one after another. But Chambord had no children. And so upon his death, who is going to follow him if he's going to be king? And so they proposed a deal. Why don't you be king until you croak? They didn't put it quite like that. And then the Orleanists will take over with the red, white, and blue flag. And he said, to his credit, no, without my principles, I am just, as he put it rather indelicately and cruelly about himself, a fat man with a big limp. And he went back to his castle, anti-Semitic jokes, and card-playing buddies. And so France lurched into a period called the moral order, the Republic of the Moral Order. You can read the details of this, which are not fascinating, but we'll get through this and move on to more interesting things. In 1875, there's an amendment to the Constitution that essentially voted by one vote, approved by one vote by the Assembly, that essentially transforms France into a republic. In 1877, a general called Mac-Mahon, who had fought in the 1870-71 war, you may think that that's not a very French name. There's a strong Irish influence around Bordeaux. In fact, one of the great Bordeaux wines is called Linge Bage, Linge as in lynch, which is an Irish name, but Mac-Mahon was a French, and that he is a general and becomes president of the state. And he tries in 1877 on the 16th of May to overthrow the government, and basically a question of responsibility to whom. It's not interesting. He fails to do that. And France, in the early 1880s, you have this sort of rooting of the Republic. And a rooting in the Republic because most people in France wanted one. It seemed to be the regime that divided France least, what Gambetta called the nouvelle couche, or the new social strata, the middle classes, the petty bourgeois. Workers obviously didn't want a monarchy. But in many areas of France, particularly in the south, lots of peasants did want a republic, and France becomes a republic. And this republic is strongly identified with Paris. And if, because of the fear of Caesarism, the fear of another Napoleon or another Robespierre before that, or another Napoleon III, they create an executive authority that's extremely weak. Power is in the chamber of deputies, in the assembly. And the president is a convener. He tries to get people to do the right things, and it's a political club. They all tutoie each other, even if they hate each other's politics. I mean, they call each other by the informal name. And even though it's decentralized, it does not mean that the state is not strong, and that the state will not be making decisions that will affect the lives of ordinary people. And the most controversial of those decisions will ultimately be in 1905, if you exclude going to war and getting all these millions of people killed, was the separation of church and state. And that is the work of a strongly centralized government centered in Paris, as I've said over and over again, but imposing its will, for better or for worse, on the provinces. And in doing so, following train tracks, following the roads, following these centralized sort of vines that going out from Paris into the provinces as a way of exerting its will, its influence, and its patronage. And in conclusion, the state becomes the new ways that patronage, economic, financial, cultural, political, is dispensed. It replaces the nobility, the local nobles. It replaces the church, and it replaces the monarchy that most people in France did not want. Next time, let's talk about identity, and let's talk about one of my favorite topics, the role of the schools in towns and in villages. See ya.